Good afternoon. I'm J. Lenora Bressler, and welcome to the December 7th, 2017 edition of the Bible Delight in the Details. One of the things that you have to keep in mind when you are trying to understand the Bible is that context is king. That's why it is very dangerous to take a verse out of context and talk about what it means. I'll give you an easy example of that. We've all heard the famous quote, where two or more are gathered in my name, there in the midst of them I am. Well, that's very comforting, but it's usually misunderstood. God certainly is where two or three are gathered in his name, but he's there where one person is gathered in his name. It's interesting that the context of that scripture has to do with church discipline. And when you have to try to win back a brother or sister, and that's a very difficult and awkward and disconcerting thing to have to do. And Christ is, in that verse, he's actually giving you confidence that when you have to do that, he will be there. He will help direct you and tell you what to say. One of the things that is very important, and I talk about this a lot with my class, is that the chapters and verses are there for convenience, and we're grateful for them. But they do sometimes obscure the meaning of the Bible, to be quite blunt, if you do not read behind and ahead of the scripture. Chapters and verses were not original, and they are man-made. They are for convenience. In 1227, a professor at the University of Paris, who would later become the Archbishop of Canterbury, divided the Bible's books into chapters for ease in teaching and preaching and commenting. And then later in 1551, another person, a French printer, actually, is the one that divided the chapters into actual verses. And the first Bible that had chapters and verses as we would know them today was published in 1555 by that same French printer. It was after that Jewish scholars, conveniently for us as Christians, decided that they would also divide the Jewish scriptures along the same lines as had already been done. So for the Old Testament. Now, why is this a problem? It's because, unfortunately, those divisions, while I'm sure the people meant well and tried their very best, we do not consider those inspired, and therefore there are problems with them. And sometimes where the division is, it obscures the message. There are many, many examples of this, and you know, one of the things, a place where you'll find it a lot is frankly in the Gospels, because a lot of times what you'll find in the Gospels as you're reading the narratives is there's story after story after story, little story, little story, little story, little story about what Jesus is doing. He's going and meeting someone. He's having an interaction with somebody else on the road to somebody else. And if you just take one of those stories and you look at it, oh yes, you can get wonderful insight, but do you get the underlying message? I give you an example. There's in all of the Gospels, actually, there is a long passage that talks about things like the children. Bring the children to me. You know, the apostles did not think the children were worthy, were honorable enough, were important enough to bother the master with them. And Jesus is saying, oh no, bring them. Well, then we've got people that have disabilities, and somebody is trying to keep them away from Christ because they don't think they're important enough. And we see Christ honoring them and saying, no, bring them, come on. You know, and then we see people that, you know, women and people that were not considered socially important in that era, outcasts, lepers, etc. And we see little stories about that. And then interspersed with those stories, we also see people that thought they were all that in a bag of chips, the religious leaders, etc., and how Jesus was very, to say uncomplimentary would not be an exaggeration. It would be an understatement. it's only when you see all of those together, not divided up into the different chapters, that you realize that the author of that gospel is making a point, that he has a theme. It also explains sometimes why there may appear on the surface to be some disconnect or some inconsistencies between gospel messages, or I should say gospel timelines. But that you got to realize, no, the Gospels are not biopics on the Bio channel. They're not trying to necessarily give you a strict chronology day to day. It's not a diary. It's not a journal. It's not a biography. It's more of a dissertation. So, for example, if I was writing about you and your life, and I wanted just to emphasize the happiness that you brought to other people, I would leave out a lot of other things, right? I would just talk about certain things and certain stories and certain times when you brought great joy. If I were focusing more on how you helped people through struggles and you got in the ditch with them in the bad times, well, I would have different stories, and they might not be in chronological order because who cares? That wasn't the point. Each of the gospel writers had a point of view, something that they were trying to get across to their readers about, in this case, Christ and his work. And sometimes the chapters and verses obscure that. So just be sure that whenever you're reading a passage in the Bible, you always back up and kind of get a running start into it. And then you continue past the finish line for quite a few more verses, just to be sure that you're not missing the forest for seeing the tree. I'm J. Lenora Bressler. Visit me again on the next edition of the Bible, Delight in the Details. I hope you're having a great December month.